All right, let's jump right in. Today, we are walking through a seriously fascinating explainer covering a really powerful analysis by writer Jimmy Perez. We're going to unpack his unique, highly reflective look at the final chapter of the Gospel of Mark. Now, typically, when people think of Mark 16, they think of it strictly as an ending, just the wrap up of a historical narrative. But Perez, he approaches this text completely differently. He looks at it not just as some event frozen in the past, but as an actual blueprint for human transformation. It's a very active, very real invitation for us right now, today. And this actually leads us straight into Perez's central and honestly pretty provocative question. He asks, will I continue living as though the stone is still covering the tomb? Or will I step into the new life Christ has made possible? What's really captivating here is how he essentially forces us to look in the mirror. He suggests that the empty tomb isn't just about what happened to Jesus. It's a profound metaphor for what is supposed to happen within us. Are we stuck in the past, just trapped behind our own obstacles? Or are we actually moving forward? Let's break down exactly how Perez maps out this journey. That brings us to our first major theme, moving the unmovable stone. Perez starts by zeroing in on a massive, seemingly insurmountable logistical problem. He sets the scene of the biblical story for us. Picture these women walking toward the tomb where Jesus was buried. They're carrying spices, they are fully expecting death, and they are intensely worried about who is going to roll away the massive stone blocking the entrance. But before they even get there, God has already moved it. So how does Perez bridge this ancient story to our modern psychology? Well, he argues that we all have our own unmovable stones, right? Deep wounds that feel impossible to heal, stubborn habits, entrenched fears, and old identities we just can't seem to shake. Just like those women, we spend an immense amount of energy stressing over the barrier. But this brilliantly illustrates Perez's core thesis here. The past does not have ultimate authority. Neither does failure, and neither does fear. The things you are so convinced will define you forever actually do not have the final word. It's a total perspective shift. Rather than focusing entirely on the obstacle, Perez asks us to turn inward with this reflection. What stone am I convinced cannot be moved that God may already be working to overcome? Just think about that for a second. We spend so much time obsessing over the barrier that we might be completely blind to the fact that the groundwork for removing it has already been laid. Okay, moving right along to section 2, grace for past failures. Here, Perez highlights this tiny, easily missed detail in the narrative that changes absolutely everything. When the angel speaks to the women at the empty tomb, the instruction is incredibly specific. The angel says, "Go, tell his disciples and Peter." Just those two little words, "and Peter," carry a massive amount of psychological and spiritual weight in Perez's analysis. Why is that such a big deal? Well, it comes down to the number 3. Just days prior to this, Peter had denied even knowing Jesus 3 distinct times, right when the pressure was at its absolute peak. Peter had so confidently promised he would never leave, yet he failed spectacularly. Perez points out that Peter likely believed this failure was completely fatal, that it had permanently ruined his relationship with Jesus and permanently defined who he was. Look at how Perez sharply contrasts the internal narratives of shame and grace using Peter's situation. He writes that God does not define us by our worst moment. Shame tells us, you are what you did. It essentially locks us in the tomb of our past mistakes. But grace says you are still loved and you are still invited forward. Perez emphasizes that true personal transformation can only begin when we actually stop allowing our past failures to have more authority than forgiveness. So he puts the challenge right back on us. Am I allowing my failures to define me more than God's grace? Are you holding yourself hostage to a version of yourself that doesn't even exist anymore? Perez is urging us to realize that releasing the past isn't just some nice feel-good idea. It is the absolute prerequisite for stepping into any kind of new life. But even if we do manage to let go of the past, we often stumble on what comes next. That brings us to our third theme, recognizing the unexpected. Perez notes a really fascinating dynamic going on here. Even after the resurrection, Jesus' followers fiercely struggle to actually believe it. If you quickly map out the chronological appearances, first to Mary Magdalene, then to the other disciples walking out in the country, and finally to the remaining 11 disciples, there is this crazy, consistent theme of disbelief. Why? Perez argues it's because they were completely bound by their own rigid expectations. Their profound grief and their preconceived notions of exactly how this story was supposed to end actually blinded them to the reality unfolding right in front of their faces. And here's where Perez hits us with a really powerful, practical insight for today. He states that faith requires the humility to believe God is moving, even when it doesn't match our expectations. We do this all the time, don't we? We expect a door to open over here, and when a window opens over there, we just complain about the draft. We expect restoration to look a very specific way, and when it doesn't fit our exact mold, we assume nothing is happening at all. Perez reminds us that restoration often means creating something completely new, not just patching up the old stuff. Which brings us to another of Perez's vital reflective questions. Where might God already be working that I have failed to recognize because it looks different than I expected? It's a direct call to broaden our vision. It's an invitation to stop forcing reality into our narrowly constructed little boxes and to stay open to unexpected avenues of growth and healing. Once we begin to recognize this internal transformation, it fundamentally alters how we interact with the world around us. Let's look at Section 4, Sharing the Transformation. According to Perez, the followers of Jesus were never meant to simply receive this good news and just sit on it. Personal transformation is a catalyst, and it is designed to be shared outward. He captures this beautifully with a really striking quote. He says, "The world does not simply need people who can explain faith, it needs people who demonstrate it." He firmly believes that if you have truly experienced grace, the natural, completely unavoidable byproduct is that you begin extending grace to others. If you've received forgiveness, you offer it. The greatest testimony isn't found in a perfectly crafted verbal explanation. It's found in a life lived with tangible compassion, integrity, and humility. So we're left with this incredibly challenging metric for our own lives. Is my life becoming evidence of the hope I have received? It's one thing to claim an internal change, but Perez pushes us to examine if our daily actions, our patience, our generosity, actually serve as living proof of that change. Are we an actual example of transformation, or are we just consumers of it? And finally, we hit the concluding section of Perez's framework, Section 5, the mirror of Mark 16. Perez looks at the very end of the chapter, where Jesus ascends into heaven. Now, on the surface, this looks like a departure. It looks like the disciples are being left completely alone, but Perez views this as the ultimate movement towards spiritual maturity. At the beginning of their journey, they needed a physical presence right beside them just to feel safe, but by the end, they shift to carrying a spiritual presence within them. This brilliantly illustrates one of Perez's most profound takeaways. God does not always change the situation around us first. He changes the person within the situation. The disciples' external circumstances remained just as dangerous and difficult as they were before, but the fearful people who ran away had become courageous messengers. They were completely different people, facing the exact same circumstances. Man, isn't that a trap we all fall into? Perez asks, am I waiting for everything around me to change before I begin living differently? We tell ourselves things like, I'll be more patient when my job is less stressful, or I'll be more generous when the economy is better. We constantly wait for perfect external conditions to justify our internal change. But Perez's analysis shows that true transformation always works from the inside out, regardless of the environment. He summarizes this everyday journey of transformation as a series of constant, deliberate choices. Every single time we choose love over hatred, hope over despair, humility over pride, forgiveness over bitterness, and faith over fear, Perez says something within us rises. The old self loses its grip and a new creation starts to emerge. It's not about sudden, overnight perfection. It's about this steady, daily momentum toward becoming who you were always meant to be. And that brings us to Jimmy Perez's ultimate provocative invitation. The stone is moved. The past doesn't hold you anymore. The question he leaves us with, the question that Mark 16 asks every single one of us, is simply this: will you come out of the old life and walk into the new?